This panel is going to look at another role, Germany's role in the international arena. While Berlin decided against participation in Iraq, against participation in Libya, it has had a substantial role in the Balkans, in Afghanistan. It more recently has helped out the Kurds. And our question then is whether or not Germany will take an increasing role in the international arena. In just a few days, Germany will assume the deputy command in Operation Resolute Support. This is the operation that will follow now the Afghanistan conflict. At the beginning of the year, President Gauck, Defense Minister von der Leyen, and Foreign Minister Steinmeier initiated in speeches to the Munich Security Conference a discussion about Germany's future role. There have been a lot of debate, discussion over the past year on this issue. In this panel, I would like to ask the four distinguished panelists to address this issue. It has there's tremendous experience here in front of you, and I look forward very much to hearing what they have to say on this evolving role or lack of evolving role. Let me introduce the panelists very shortly and point you to their bios that are in the program for a longer introduction. Of course, our former ambassador to the U.S. And to London, Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, who is now Global Head of Government Relations, Allianz. Dr. Lily Gartner-Feldman, to his left, is the director at AICGS of Society, Culture, and Politics Program. The next to her left is Dr. Anne-Marie Le Gloignac. She is professor and senior research fellow at the Sorbonne Sciences Po. And finally, last but not least, is of course Ambassador Thomas Matusek, who was the ambassador to India, to the United Nations, and to London. Not exactly in that order, but welcome to all of you. Let me start by asking you to address German foreign and security policy today. What you see is its role today, how well it's equipped for that role, but even more important, what you anticipate for the future. And I will sit down and hear your remarks. Thank you. And I would like Wolfgang to start, since his conference really started this debate.
Well, first of all, Gail, thank you very much, and I'll try to limit myself to just a few observations before trying to respond to your question. Let me make one comment on what our speaker, Bob Zelig, said, just simply to reinforce a point he made about what was said or what was not promised in 1990. I happened to be the chief German negotiator when the NATO-Russia Founding Act was negotiated in the mid-90s, 5 years after unification. And I spent many, many hours with all sorts of Russian negotiators. Not once was the argument made by our Russian counterparts that the very idea of NATO enlargement to the east was going to be questioned or countered by this alleged argument that earlier promises had been made which would not allow this kind of development. So my point simply is, if the Russians had, in 95, 96, remembered any such promise made to them in 89, 90, they would have surely raised it. And I can't think of a better point to strengthen the argument made by Bob earlier. Now, on your question, I think first of all, sort of in terms of simple categories, you need to distinguish between pre-1990 Germany, which was a Germany handicapped in terms of sovereignty, and post-1990. The problem with German foreign policy in the post-1990 world up until today has been that we showed up on the world platform with unification completed, but not really with knowing what exactly should be the role of Germany from now on. We had to figure it out. On very fundamental issues, there were what I would call the three never-agains, which to a certain extent existed in conflict with each other. There was never again alone, which was a commitment to multilateralism. There was never again war, which was sort of the pacifists, the far left, not only the far left, the left. And then there was never again fascism, also more a leftist argument, but also never again genocide, which was more an argument later used in the Kosovo dispute to justify a multilateral intervention, sort of pro-humanitarian intervention. So I think we've had to work our way through these, in a way, competing never-agains. I'm not sure that we have resolved this completely at this moment, but I want to just add one other observation. In my view, post-1990 Germany has been having a never-ending love affair with the status quo. Because, and it's quite easy to understand if you happen to be a German, we have had more revolutionary and evolutionary change than most other nations during the 20th century. From the First War to the Weimar Republic to Nazism to the devastations of World War II to the Holocaust to the guilt to the rebuilding to the division and finally to unification. That's been a lot of change for most Germans. And I think that there is a pervasive sense throughout Germany, regardless of East or West, which indicates, you know, I'd rather be left alone now. We're actually not in bad shape. And why do we have to get involved again? Why are we going to be again confronted with change? Chancellor Merkel, when she was trying to get elected the first time, almost lost that bid because she proposed to the Germans domestic, tax change, etc. And the Germans were not so sure whether they liked the idea of too much change. Germans love the status quo. I think the big challenge for the German leadership is to explain to Germans that they should not love the status quo. They should embrace change. That's hard. Thanks.
Thank you. Lily? Dr. Feltman?
I'd like to build on what Wolfgang just said and come back to the point that Bob Zoellick made at the beginning, which is that we need some benchmarks. So he started with unification, and I think we need to, and Wolfgang also did this, look at the goals and the mechanisms that Germany has had since unification so that we can be talking about how might it now indeed change, because it's a world in flux, it's a world in major change. So I'd like to suggest that Germany in the past 25 years, up until recently, and now the change is going on, has had 6 goals, 3 in its external environment, and those have been to sustain permanent peace, as you said, never again war. And often it is said German foreign policy is peace policy. So to sustain permanent peace, to sustain economic and security stability, this gets to your status quo issue. And thirdly, to sustain predictability, again, that's the status quo, in the international liberal or in the liberal international system. There are also 3 goals in how Germany should be seen in the world, and I think this is a very special German dimension again. Wolfgang referred to it also. Germany should be seen as a country to be respected. That was definitely a goal in foreign policy, has been a goal, still is. Secondly, it should be seen as a country that has confronted its past in its foreign policy, has acknowledged its responsibility for past deeds. This is very German, and one could say uniquely German, because if you look around the world, there really are very few, if any, examples of countries doing this. And thirdly, it has been wanted to be seen abroad as a country that is reliable and calculable. So what are the instruments that have gone with this? Again, I'd say there are 6 instruments. 3 are similar to the instruments that other European middle powers would have. But I think there's been a particular German commitment and a particular German intensity. These are to develop highly structured, highly institutionalized economic and political bilateral relationships, both in Europe and beyond. The highest form of this is these joint cabinet consultations that Germany has, very remarkable in the international system, including today with China, but certainly with other major European countries and with Israel. A second instrument has been an active multilateralism, that Germany and multilateralism go hand in hand. EU, NATO, OSCE, UN. A third instrument that is not necessarily dissimilar, except in intensity from other countries, European countries, a balance of policies based on pragmatic interests and value-oriented policies. Germany has been particularly good at balancing those 2 dimensions. Question is today whether they can stay in balance. And then there are 3, again, uniquely German instruments after 1989 through today to extend the reconciliation that it clearly developed with France, clearly developed with Israel, to extend that to Eastern Europe, particularly Poland and Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, not only to complete the scope of dealing with history, because these were big parts of history that hadn't been dealt with, but also to try to guarantee a stable Europe as a whole, not just Western Europe, but the whole of Europe. And the second set of instruments that I think are particularly German, to combine soft power, economics, culture, with which it was already familiar, with hard power of military engagement. And that obviously was new after 1989. You're all familiar with that. But again, with limits, Iraq War, Libya, I mean, it wasn't a total move into military power. And the third uniquely German instrument, and this is something that Bob Zelig referred to, and it came up in the question, I think is critical, to elevate the role of non-state actors, civil society actors, in the recognition of their growing significance in the international arena. And we have to be very careful. It's not just public opinion that we need to look at, but how public opinion is expressed in civil society actors. And they are often the more reliable gauges of how society views international leadership or relations with particular countries. There's a third feature I would like to emphasize in addition to goals and instruments, and that is style. In this period up until now, Germany has been relatively unobtrusive, relatively quiet, doesn't mean it hasn't been active, extremely active, but relatively unobtrusive, relatively quiet, a team player. So those are the things that I think are the benchmarks. Well, what are the changes today? I'm not so sure that the goals have changed. I think some of them have been achieved, like international respect, the reputation for reliability. Germany has achieved those internationally, and that in turn has allowed other things, which means changes in instruments. But the other thing that I think is absolutely critical is that there's been a change in the international context in which these goals are set. And Foreign Minister Steinmeier has been quite colourful in referring to this. He talks about the world coming apart at the seams. He talks about the world order unraveling. He talks about crises coming at us thick and fast. He talks about crises from multiple geographical directions in multiple issue areas. Players have undergone change. The traditional hegemon, the US, is hobbled domestically and internationally. There's the reality of a rise in China, the BRICS in general, and there's the fact of this weird combination with Russia of being wounded and assertive. And we also see that it's not just traditional governments that are challenging the liberal international system, but it's non-state actors like ISIS, ISIL. I think in all of this, Germany has recognized that it needs to play a different role in the international arena. And it's not Germany. Germany is being called on by the United States, by other Europeans, by other actors, particularly in Asia, to play a leadership role. And in the past, I've liked to suggest that Germany had developed normative power, the power to persuade, material power using economic and military instruments. Now we're talking about this notion of shaping power, and Constanze Stolzenmüller is here, who helped develop that theme together with the GMF and the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. And what does it mean to be a shaping power today? And that's the big question for Germany. And it, as Wolfgang said, and as Gail said, this was the issue at the Munich Security Conference, means the ability to shape international norms, rules, and institutions, but it also means the inability to shape the outcome of conflicts through mediation. Now, Germany has a particular strength in doing this because of what I've said previously, and because it's gained the international reputation for dealing with its past and for respectability. It has some kind of moral authority internationally, which the US doesn't have anymore, to do this. The question is, will it do it alone, or will it do it with its tested partners, perhaps the US, but increasingly in Europe, particularly France, Poland? So that, to me, is the question. The issue has been raised. The challenge is there. Will Germany meet the challenge? My sense is, whether it wants to or not, and there is the public opinion question, whether it wants it to or not, it's being pushed from the international system to be a shaping power. And that's where I think we are today.
Thank you, Lily. And let me turn now to Dr. Anne-Marie Legault.
I couldn't
ask you in particular to bring in the French perspective in EU.
I couldn't agree more with your last statement. The fact that Germany has been called on playing an increasingly important role. I'll come back to France a little later. I would like to point at two elements which seems to me very important, and which explain changes which have taken place in the past 20 to 25 years. The first one is leadership, and we forget too easily that leadership does matter, though Bob Zoellick has reminded us about it with right. I mean, leadership matters, personality matters, personalities matter a lot. And the second element is the context, and sometimes I'm just a little bit intrigued by the fact that in the conversation which is taking place here, it's like between the United States and Germany, and where is the EU? I do agree that foreign policy is not really an EU matter, but there is a context in which the Federal Republic of Germany is embedded, which is the European Union. So it's very difficult not to talk about the other partners of the Federal Republic of Germany in this particular dimension. I would like, looking at both leadership and context, mention first, the fact that the evolution since 1990 has been very, very winding. It has been a very diverse kind of evolution, starting from what I would call the limited hubris of 1991-92, when Germany recognized the former republics of Yugoslavia without having a foreign policy for it or without really consulting with the others. But we know that. I mean, limited hubris, then step-by-step involvement in the Balkans, from the Volker Ruhr saying the Bundeswehr will never go where the Reichswehr went, to stationing troops in the Balkans and participating in peace enforcement or peacekeeping missions. This was fascinating. It was a lot of courage and a lot of leadership, showing leadership and gradually shaping public opinion, culminating with the remarkable role that Germany played during the war against Serbia, in particular over Kosovo, the ceasefire, the stability pact in the Southern Balkans, and the negotiations over Kosovo that Wolfgang led in particular. Then a phase of withdrawal, I would like to recall, with the first governments of Angela Merkel, actually. That's where I would maybe we could start with Gerhard Schröder already, but certainly with Angela Merkel, and culminating with the famous decision to abstain when the decision 1972 was decided, by the way, I think on very good grounds, but this abstention was weird. And now we have much greater preeminence, we have leadership, especially leadership, but leadership in some areas and not in others, and this is maybe remarkable. Leadership, I would say, remarkable leadership concerning Russia. And if we have currently, we Europeans, if we have currently a Russia policy, this is thanks to Angela Merkel. And I tweeted the other day, just a pun, I can't resist to recall the dame is the dam, right? I mean, she's building the dam against that person. And she has this two-track policy, which is sort of continuous in Germany's history, starting with the 1960s, she offering a dialogue, but at the same time having a policy of strength. And she is increasingly clear on that. I mean, she couldn't be more clear with this interview in Der Welt the other day about, I can't remember with the time, I mean, about 10 days ago. And this is new, but again, this is in certain areas and not in others. Maybe we'll have the time to discuss that. Is it a learning curve? Is this a question of personalities? And is Angela Merkel suddenly waking up to Russia? Because this is a very important factor to her. But she has this immense talent of being able to embrace most people in Germany and most people in Europe. Not all of them, of course, but I mean very many. That's really something. We didn't have that before. The second, this winding pace, the context. The context also has changed a lot, as you mentioned. And I would mention something else. Of course, the crisis, yes. The world order is not, I mean, there is no order, sorry. But also France's decline. I mean, this is absolutely remarkable. Germany is alone. Well, not exactly, because the French are playing a role still quite overstretched in the Sahel, in sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East, but in other ways, I mean, Russia, forget it. I mean, the visit of the president was a bit timid the other day. So we have a very imbalanced situation. Here I would like to bring in something I mentioned briefly to you, which is the fact that there are very strident voices among French elites criticizing Angela Merkel in the worst manner, and very critical, I think, with no point, whereas the majority of French people are approving her policy. So there is an immense disconnect here in France, and maybe some people are going to wake up one of these days and realize that. I hope so. But others, as you mentioned, others are also calling for Germany's role. The Poles, Radek Sikorski, I mean, it was a year ago, calling for Germany's role in Europe. So we are in need of leadership, and this in a European Union which was created in order to dispense with leadership. We have a very different kind of European Union currently, and we do need leadership, and this is something that Germany needs, but not Germany needs other partners, and it would need a stronger France. And I think that's it. I mean, this is what the few remarks I was going to say at the beginning as a preliminary matter.
Thank you very much. And I want to turn now to Ambassador Tomasz Matusek. He's been stationed a number of different places that I think their reaction to a more assertive German policy would be quite interesting to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Gail. So this was quite a rich canvas already, so allow me just to add a few touches here and there. What I love about these seminars is we try to put an order into things as they happen seem to very disorderly. And I think it was Harold Macmillan who was once asked, what drives your foreign policy? And he said, events, dear boy, events. So if you look back, the Yugoslavia crisis, the 5 wars, the sending of German combat troops into Kosovo. 3 years later, 9/11, the Afghanistan engagement, starting with the conference on the Petersburg and then sending German troops. By the way, politically, both of these decisions very risky for the then government. Then not to go to Iraq. I think in order to make sense of it, we have to ask ourselves, did we have and do we have, as Bob Zoellick asked, a strategic framework? Do we have a structural framework? And are these frameworks still valid? And I have to say, I think they are. If you look at the structural framework of German foreign policy ever since its inception, is the European integration process, the transatlantic alliance, and ever since 1974, an active, proactive membership in the UN. If you look at the structure and then ask ourselves, how do we deal with crises? How did we deal with the Soviet threat? How do we deal with Ukraine? Here, I think we can go back to the Amel report, 1967, where we say we have to stand up for our values, for our principles, and not move an inch, but at the same time, stretch our hand out, keep the channels open, ready for compromise, and I think this has been a guideline until now. Now, when I hear Wolfgang, and he's quite right when he said the Germans have a love affair with the status quo. Sure. But so have other countries. I did a speaking tour here in the US, and I found out that the opinion polls showed that 65% were against involvement in foreign wars. The same 65% were outraged by the beheadings, that we have to do something about it. I think this is something which is natural in democracies, and here comes in the task of leadership of the governments, of the political leads. Public opinion is very, very important. But I think this is something which I address to all of us and our leaders is public opinion alone cannot be the driver. There is the wonderful story about Adenauer. I think it was in the discussion about German rearmament when his chief of staff Glotke came to him and said, Mr. Chancellor, we can't do this. Public opinion is against it. And Adenauer is supposed to have answered, und was tun Sie jetzt, Herr Glotke? What are you going to do about it, Mr. Glotke? And this is exactly, I think, what is and was missing in the recent years to a certain degree, and this is what Gauck, Steinmeier, von der Leyen tried to address in Munich. Not to say from now on we send our boys to harm's way, but from now on we are able and ready to deploy, if need be, all our instruments. So far it has been soft power in the beginning, then under the impression of Srebrenica, of Rwanda, it was intervention in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, then came Iraq, it went the other way. So in a way, then we settled down that we had a strong opinion to every crisis in the world. We have to stop Assad. We have to bring democracy into the Arab world. But it turned out that it was the opposite of what Teddy Roosevelt counseled to do when he asked to speak softly but carry a big stick. We spoke very loudly without carrying a stick at all. And to write that, this I think was the general gist of these three speeches in the Munich Security Conference. Now, this was a long intro before I answer Gail's question. I get asked in India, for instance, where I spent a number of years, why the hell are you Europeans, and mainly you Germans, not making more out of what you are? When we hear about Germany and Europe, we hear that you have financial difficulties, that you have enormous discussions if one should elect the Commission President directly or not. But what we like about you, your way of living, your civilizational model, this is something we are very interested in. And I think this is one thing. The other thing is that a lot of things we have experienced over the last 60 years, in one way or the other, are fairly similar to what's happening in other parts of the world. For instance, when you have tensions or a threat of war over territories, normally it's justified by victimization in history. Who was wronged at what time? And here in Germany and in Europe, what we did is schoolbook commissions, textbooks, historian commissions, etc. Other examples are, in order to lessen the danger of war, attention to have confidence-building measures. In India, Pakistan, for instance, at the Punjab border, a really hot border, you have now the commanders on two sides meeting daily in order to avoid misunderstandings. In Kashmir, you had exactly Atal Vajpayee, a BJP prime minister, same party as Modi, who started the Lahore process, who at one time said, we will never be able to solve the Kashmir problem. We Germans have never been able fundamentally to solve the German issue. But what we can do is do a number of small steps, Wandel durch Annäherung, to make in the end this line obsolete. So we are not the teachers of the world, but I think we live in a part of the world where we went to a number of very traumatic experiences that drawn our lessons, which might come in handy for others. I think, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Let me turn now to the issue of Russia and Ukraine, and ask Ambassador Ischinger, who's been to Ukraine as an envoy and who has spent some time on this issue, to comment on Germany's role and comment on the broader issue of Russia.
Okay. Can I just add one footnote to this discussion? I'm not sure that the German decision earlier this summer to send a military help to the Peshmerga in Iraq, I'm not sure that this is a direct outflow of the Gauck speech. It's a debatable point. But what I want to say is we have seen unprecedented change, unprecedented decisions made recently in this respect. I would have thought it impossible to imagine, as recently as, let's say, a year or 2 or 4 years, that we would ever consider any kind of involvement in Iraq. The German mainstream used to think Iraq, it's a matter for the Americans. They made the mistake. They should handle it. We are not going to get involved. There is now, because of the immediate danger, a change, and apparently even Germany is capable of taking proactive decisions, as we have done recently. So there is still, the point I'm trying to make is, we're actually moving, even though we are in this love affair with the status quo. But something is happening. Now, on Russia and Ukraine, Thomas Matusek mentioned already the Harmel approach. And I think this is the exact correct reference point. You're always trying to, when you're faced with a new problem, you're always trying to figure out some reference in the past. Have we had similar situations on the basis of which we can have a judgment whether what works, what doesn't work? Double-track strategies apparently work. They worked in the old NATO, in the Cold War, and I agree. I think they are also a reasonably correct approach, given the many uncertainties in the current foreign policy, as represented by President Putin, and in the circumstances in eastern Ukraine. So a double strategy, which is founded first of all on a reaffirmation of everything that's important for NATO, the Article 5 commitment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to reiterate all of this. That's the first half of the equation. And the second half, the second element of the double-track strategy is the ongoing, repeated now 100 times, offer by Chancellor Merkel and the German government, along with our partners in the EU, to engage, to discuss ways forward, etc. So far, the attempts to come to some meaningful, forward-leaning resolution have not been exactly successful. So I want to make two suggestions, or raise two issues. One is the question of a contact group. What has happened in the Ukrainian situation in September is that in Minsk, on the basis of this famous Minsk agreement, a nominal contact group was established, a contact group which is not really a contact group as I define it, between the Russian Federation, the Ukrainian government, and some representatives from the OSCE. That is, as far as I'm concerned, a recipe for disaster, because it effectively means that you're going to let a strong person negotiate with a weak person, and we've learned from history that if that goes unsupported by outside element, the strong guy always wins, no doubt about it. So this is not good for a sustainable resolution. What would be 100 times better would be a framework for resolving the Ukrainian European security crisis, where the European Union, the United States, the Russian Federation, and certainly the Ukrainian government would participate in the same way as we participated 20 years ago in the Baltic. In the Balkan conflicts, and later on in Kosovo. That would allow the weak partner, the Ukrainian government, to be accompanied and supported by a more visible international community, it would not leave the Ukrainians totally alone. Why is this not working? Why has no one tried to do this? Well, the Russians believe that the current situation is actually quite good. The Russians are saying all we need is some meaningful negotiations between Kiev and the bad guys in Donbas region. Why do we need a larger international arrangement? I think we need to push this forward. My second point...
Can I add one word to that?
Sure.
Wolfgang, that's true, but the danger at the moment is that on the ground things get out of hand. And before you have the residual trust which you need to establish such a group, I think what has to be the first thing is to do very little, very technical, very small steps, disengagement, confidence building on the ground, because what is lacking, and this I think is very, very severe, what is lacking at least the residual trust in each other to establish such a group.
Well, I think that there are signs of, we have had a more or less meaningful ceasefire worked out recently, so I think there are some movements in this direction. But let me come to my second point. Everybody who remembers my tenure as ambassador here in this country will remember that I was not exactly a fan of Don Rumsfeld, nor was Don Rumsfeld known to be a fan of me, because I criticized his approach in writing in the Washington Post, etc., and I was not very popular in the Defense Department for that at the time. But he made one rather fundamental proposal, which not on this particular situation, but in general. He said, if you cannot solve a problem, enlarge it. It's a smart approach. So here's the Don Rumsfeld approach to the Russian-Ukrainian situation. What would that mean, enlarging it? It would mean embedding the problem that we have currently in Ukraine, which means that there is a war going on in Europe, in spite of the fact that we've had all these numerous arms control arrangements, 2+4 agreement, the Helsinki Final Act, the Charter of Paris, etc., etc. And still, we don't seem to have a sustainably secure architecture in Europe. So I think what is now being proposed is by using frameworks such as the OSCE, which encompasses all 57 nations in the Euro-Atlantic and Euro-Asian space, more or less, to try to reaffirm those principles which were first elaborated in the Helsinki Final Act and in the Charter of Paris, and to draw our Russian friends, quote unquote, into a debate whether we can agree on a definition of what self-determination and sovereignty mean and what they don't mean. I mean, I don't want to speak for too long, but at this moment, the Russians have dug themselves a really deep hole in this respect. I want to be very concrete. During the Kosovo crisis, from 1998 to 2008 and beyond, the Russians argued that the Kosovars may not have the independence which they aspired to, because the central government in Belgrade did not agree to this request. President Putin, in his recent Valdai speech regarding Ukraine, said exactly the opposite. He said there is no law that says that the Crimean population needed the consent of the government in Kiev to to vote in favor of to have this referendum and to become part of the Russian Federation. But now, let me conclude. Now, it is not possible that both Putin approaches are correct. It is not possible. Only one can work. And I think it is relatively easy in a discussion with the Russians to tell them, now, let's decide. Is Putin one, the correct one, namely the Kosovo approach, or is the Ukrainian approach the correct one? You guys, you Russians, must finally figure out which interpretation of international law you want to adhere to. So I think this kind of a larger debate about the principles which we believe we agree to, but where there are fundamental differences of interpretation, I think that could be a useful, not the only, but a useful additional process which would allow us to engage each other rather than shouting across the fence at the other side that both sides are violating the rules, which is what is currently happening, which is, of course, a very unfortunate situation from a diplomatic point of view. I'll stop here.
Well, you've laid out a fascinating solution approach in any case. Ambassador Matusik really wants to say something. And could I then, we have about 10 more minutes, so maybe I ask each of you very
say
short.
one sentence
and then
only.
So we could go out to Q.
I'm not sure that the Rumsfeld doctrine
we started
will work,
quite
because our objective is not to prove Putin wrong. We all know he's wrong. Our objective is how to help him to get out of the hole he's dug himself into. I mean, if this were, just a quiz show, who is right, who is wrong, that's different. But here,
we shouldn't help him too much.
No, Putin is in a dilemma. Putin's dilemma, and there is a built-in dynamism. It drives him to the wrong direction even further. And this, I think, must be our first strategic aim: to show him a face-saving way to get out of it.
Lily?
I'd just like to say that I think the crisis with Russia and Ukraine is emblematic for the challenges to German foreign policy, except it's in Europe's and Germany's backyard. But it has features of other, whether you're talking about what's happening on the Temple Mount today, whether you're talking about the territorial and historical issues in East Asia, we're talking about provocations, clear provocations. We're talking about what is the role of international law and has it been violated? And we're talking about history-based conflicts. And all of these conflicts that we could mention, including the one that you referred to, I mean, a lot of the intractability of these conflicts is that there are differing interpretations of history. And it seems to me that we see a direct challenge to what I mentioned before, the pragmatic basis of German foreign policy, which is the economic dimension with Russia, versus the values-oriented aspect of German foreign policy. Do you let this guy get away with it? And you have the debate in Germany between this letter, this appeal of 60-plus luminaries, there should never be war again in Europe, versus others who say, well, sometimes there has to be war. It was the old Balkans debate, never again war because of Auschwitz, or we need war because of Auschwitz. We need, there is such thing as just war. So that comes in again. The intractability, I think, is very important because it raises another level again, getting back to Zeleg, because people have been looking at civil society. If governments can't talk, and they can't talk easily now, what is the role for civil society to air these differences, not to resolve them, but to air them, maybe understand them, and people looking to the German-Polish relationship, to the Russian-Polish relationship, to the Polish-Ukraine relationship. What are the mechanisms that have been developed there to deal with history? And a number of people now are looking to see, is any of that relevant in terms of new channels, given that the sclerosis of the governmental channels and the trust issue, one could argue, is built at the societal level. for the long term. Governments come and go, and I would argue then that, if we think about Russia and solutions for Russia and Germany's role, we could talk about the same set of issues for the East Asia conflict and for the Middle East conflict. And Germany is involved at the both governmental level and societal level in both of those conflicts already.
I can't really agree with anything which has been said here concerning Russian Germany or Russian Europe, because we can't leave aside the nature of Russian power, or rather of Putin's power, which is a vertical power concentrated in the hands of a man who is hoarding, actually, power and money. It's a kleptocratic state in very many respects. And plus, the other thing is, so talking is fine, we have to leave channels open, but this is not going to get anywhere. So I don't see here how we can make any progress, and I don't see here that there is a dilemma here. Putin is going to go forth. He started with Abkhazia and South Ossetia in 2008, he goes on with Crimea, he goes on with seeding chaos in Ukraine. What is going to be the next move? There are different solutions probably. He may think, well, maybe the whole of Ukraine, or maybe chaos, or look for different kinds of solutions, but it's certainly not going to stop there. As to civil society, we know we have a huge problem here in Russia, because we have 59% of Russians who currently think, according to the latest Levada opinion poll in Levada Center is the last independent opinion poll center, thinking they are very well informed by their state media. So what do? We have a few lone voices that we all know of, that we are talking to, and they are talking to us, but what else can we do? So we have a totally different kind of issue here on our hands, a new issue since the 1990s, since reunification, and I don't see really how we are going to proceed, except trying to maintain as much as we can a united front in Europe and in the United States all together. I think this is primary and extremely important.
Thank you. Due to restricted time, if I can take the two questions. If I can take the two questions,
okay.
Bill Groziak here, and there's one back here in the corner, and we'll take them together then. Excuse me, Thomas, did you have a comment?
No, it's fine. This will go on for a long time, so I rest my case.
Well, these two questions together, and then responses from our panel.
Yeah, a question directly related to the title of this panel. One of Germany's most remarkable accomplishments in foreign policy has been to cultivate peaceful and prosperous relations with all 9 of its neighbors. Yet Russia still seems to be rooted in the era of Peter the Great about cordon sanitaire, that its security can only be achieved through destabilizing its neighbors. So I'm curious, given Germany's close dialogue with Russia, how can you convey the success of the German example to the Russians in that the 21st century, in an era of ballistic missiles and terrorism and the internet, that destabilizing your neighbors does not help your security, it only hurts it?
Yes, sir. If you could identify yourself.
Detchen, Vice Chairman of the AICGS. There's always the old saw that Germany is too small for the world but too big for Europe. My question is there's increasingly more countries, more world leaders who are viewing Germany as a sort of third or fourth world power. And just this pressure that you had mentioned to become a shaper of events, how comfortable does Germany feel about becoming a shaper of world policy, foreign policy, unanchored from the EU?
Thank you. Maybe we start with Ambassador Matusik.
Well, to start with the last question, unanchored from the EU would be a recipe for disaster. I think this was one of the reasons for the two catastrophes of the last century, that Germany, in the center of Europe, the biggest in the center of Europe, was unanchored. And this was the reason why Adenauer made the very wise decision to join the European integration process, transatlantic alliance. Now, about your question, Russia and the future. I think we are seeing a time where we also should put some emphasis on the second half of the Amel doctrine. It is very, very easy, and you're 100% right, to show down the whole list what Putin has done wrong. But we excluded military means now. So, what is left? Will sanctions be the answer? Will we just raise the economic price for Russia to make them cave in? I don't see that in a system like that. I think we should, at the same time as showing our resolves at being united, at the same time say, okay, we live in the same neighborhood. You don't have any say into the eternal workings of other countries. But as we are in the neighborhood, let's start with a whole series of confidence-building measures to see and to show the other side that we only can do it in a cooperative approach. Because the hostile approach alone doesn't bring any results. I think it's totally excluded that we can crank up the sanctions to a degree where Putin says, sorry folks, I give up, you're right. This will not happen. So we have to balance both sides of the Amel doctrine, and in Germany, to call a spade a spade. Steinmeier is more or less what I would suggest. Angela Merkel's advisor, not shares of advisors, are more or less on the other side. And we have to find in Europe a cohesive philosophy to deal with that. At the moment, Europe is relatively united, but I see signs that it might fall apart again. And this is why this council coming up so important.
Yes, Anne-Marie?
Maybe just a note on this. I mean, we should start with helping the Ukrainians more, but we are not doing it. I mean, our policy is full of contradictions. CBMs. I mean, confidence building measures would work if the other party, in that case the Kremlin, would be ready to engage in trust and confidence building measure, which I don't think they are. I mean, he is rather. The future is pretty bleak on that. I mean, the second question was on, unattached, unanchored. I don't see, unless there is a catastrophe taking place, in particular in the Eurozone, I don't see any reason why Germany shouldn't remain unanchored. I mean, it is the pivot of the European Union, and there is such a degree of intimacy. I mean, I mean by this legal and political and so on and so forth in the European Union that it doesn't look really like breaking apart.
Yes, Dr. Feldman?
Just very quickly on the question of Russia, I think we are in a debate now about who lost Russia and how did we lose Russia. Particularly in Germany, but in the United States. And I think we therefore need to look in great detail at how we didn't lose these countries and how we established these very clear partnerships with these countries after 1989. It would be instructive to do that in detail. And part of it was acknowledging their grievances, their historical grievances, and also building close military relations. David Detchen's point, I think, is very important because both the Chinese president and the South Korean president, when they visited Germany and at other times, have very much looked to Germany to play a role in East Asia, not only economically, clearly, but in terms of historical conflicts. I don't think that's going to happen unilaterally. If Germany's going to take up that challenge, it's going to do it with the US or with the EU. So I don't see Germany, and both countries see Germany in their overtures, particularly their economic but also political overtures, as the gateway to Europe. So it's not trying to separate off Germany from Europe. It's part and parcel of the same thing.
Yes, Ambassador Schinger?
Yeah, just a couple of points. First, I agree with those who have raised the question or who have argued that resolving the Ukrainian crisis is not something which is near, which is immediately possible. I think we need to exercise strategic patience. We are in this for the long haul, and I think we have the better cards, far better cards than the Russians, and we will prevail if we handle this as we have tried without falling apart within the European Union. Surprisingly to the Russians, we have not fallen apart so far. And if we can maintain that, I think we'll be in good shape. Point two, I certainly agree with Tom's response to the Detjen question. The response to the crisis and to the challenge has got to be more EU, not less EU. And my own recipe would be Germany should now be the driver in the EU, if possible, with, of course, France and others, to create within the EU a real capacity for pooling and sharing military resources where we spend too much in too wasteful a manner. We could get hugely more bang for the buck if we spend our military euro more sensibly among the 28 member countries of the European Union. I can't go into the details, but I think this has got to be the strategic vision for the next decade coming out of this current crisis. And my last point is on the question how to deal with Russia. We need to make sure that whatever we do in terms of sanctions or as some people would propose, trying to punish the Russians for bad behavior, let's make sure that no one in Russia can suspect the Western policy approach to be one which is designed to achieve regime change in Moscow. That would be really a recipe for disaster. In other words, our objective in terms of what we do with the sanctions has got to be, can this measure lead over time to helping to stabilize Ukraine, yes or no? It's not about punishing or letting the Russians fall into an eternal hole. I think that's a very important policy question, and my impression is that not everybody in Washington is on that same wavelength that I'm trying to propose here. Final point, on the sanctions, I was in Moscow a week ago, and I had discussions with a couple of members of the Duma. We need to be aware, ladies and gentlemen, that some effects of our sanctions are unintended. Sanctions are never, a great instrument. And this one member of the Duma said to me, it's too bad I'm not on the sanctions list. Apparently, I'm not important enough. Thank you very much.
A great way to end, and thank you all four of our panelists. And I believe we're having 10 minutes for a coffee break, and I'm sure that all of our panelists are willing to answer any questions you might have had. Thank you.
Thanks.
That was
great.